As old journalistic business models crumble, an increasing number of news organizations are using grant funding to pay for their reporting. But now a new study by the American Press Institute says that approach poses some problems of its own. To be clear, we're talking about things like American Experience's Look at Las Vegas, which was funded in part by that city's convention bureau.
Now that Wall Street had come to Sodom and Gomorrah, there was no longer any reason to put up with the mob.
The producers were upfront about where the money came from, and according to the study, most media outlets are. 99% identify their funders. But there's a catch. Only about a third of nonprofit media have written guidelines on editorial independence, even though their benefactors frequently have a clear interest in how the story is reported. That's the problem, that a lot of these stories wouldn't be reported at all. Why are you going to do a story on Las Vegas? I mean, what's the new angle? But it was funded in part by the convention bureau there. So you know that they don't want you digging too deep. They're not going to want you, airing out too much laundry there. And I should say that WGBH 89.7 also has a couple of situations. It's not like we're running the editorial stories by them, but they're interested in a certain angle.
Yeah. Well, I'm a bit conflicted about this too. We have the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, which also has a foot here at WGBH, and we get funding from organizations, but it oftentimes, typically, it'll work in that the newsroom will have an idea for a story they want to go after, and then we'll find a funder. So the initiative starts with the newsroom. But then again, so immediately you're self-selecting. You're going to go to an organization that believes that the story will be in their interest. So it gets you into an area where you feel it's a little bit, you want to be very cautious, and but I do like the idea of there being written guidelines, and absolutely believe there should always be disclosure.
The danger being to make it clear that you don't want a situation where the funder is insisting that you run the editorial content before them first, before it goes to air or print.
The risk is much higher for editorial misdeeds when the funding is happening at the story level. If you're funding at the organizational level, ProPublica, the Center for Investigative Reporting, they get funding from lots of different nonprofit sources and foundations, but it's funding the institution as opposed to a specific story. I'm on the board of the Hechinger Report, which covers education news, and they get funding from the Gates Foundation, which has very strong opinions about education policy, and the Lumina Foundation, which has very strong opinions about education policy.
We take money from them.
Their strategy has been, we want to have funding from lots of different sources, so no one source is so important to us that we would shape our editorial content towards it. And this is also a question for NPR. NPR doesn't have guidelines about who they will take meetings with from a funding opportunity. We remember the controversy that happened a few years ago around that. It's something that they want to judge on a case-by-case basis, and that's the tension. Do you have strict guidelines, or do you sort of evaluate each case as it comes along?
Well, I'm somebody who, during the course of my long and sordid career, had a couple of stories killed because of the concerns of advertisers.
Really?
So I can't get all that excited about the conflicts that arise with nonprofit organizations. I do think it can happen, and some of the concerns that you raise are absolutely legitimate. I think one of the big issues we have to deal with about this, I think that most of these funders are pretty good about not insisting that a story be slanted a certain way. But when you pay for something, you get more of it. And you may be getting more of it than your audience particularly wants. Like, we're going to fund a bunch of stories on the fate of the sea anemone in the era of global warming. And, maybe the audience couldn't care less about the sea anemone.
Well, there is that. But I think the key is, it wasn't quite clear in the piece that we read about people not running the finished product or the near finished product by the funders. So they said they have conversations. But if I'm understanding it, then the conversations happen at the beginning of the process. Here, we're going to fund you. Yes, you're going to go do the sea anemone. That should be the end of it. Then the next time the funder sees it, when the product is done and published where or aired where it's going to be, if something else is happening, you really have a problem. I'm not saying that all the issues you've raised here are not things that we need to take into account, particularly the crafting and writing of guidelines that everybody is aware of. But that one piece, if that's not attended to, you really have a problem.
Yeah, see, the problem is that some of these get renewed, year by year, and I'm sure it's in part based on how well you kind of, portray their vision. you
Right,
know?
right. No, their funders have demands, and it's up to the journalist organization to maintain editorial integrity. And it's also worth noting that there are some organizations, not the reputable ones, but news organizations that are nonprofit, but don't reveal who their funding sources are. And these are often
very
coming,
few.
very few, but
They said
they are
1%.
often politically motivated,
Yeah.
and they
Well, that's
they
a
are
good
out
point.
there. And
Oh, well, let's help them.